So F125 is here then, and as always, I am doing a handling review, looking into how the game drives, and spoilers, there's some reasonably big changes here. So the first thing you need to know is no, they haven't gone back to F123's handling model. It is an evolution of F124. But before you click away, it is definitely improved on that. If you're going to join F125, you need to accept the direction they're going in now, which I have come to accept. 80% of their player base is on controller for a start. And realistically, with EA, the size of EA's marketing budget, they're trying to appeal to a super wide audience. If they made a really niche, really hard to drive sim, even if it was really realistic, anyone who buys it is going to immediately refund it and go, this is too hard, I'm not going to do it. That doesn't necessarily mean it has to be full arcade and just a silly mobile game, and it isn't. But you do have to accept this isn't a sim. Let's move on. So then, how does it drive? As I said, it is evolved from F124, so it does drive most similar to F124 than any other game. But they have made a number of key improvements. First of all, the front end. On F124, it was crazy. It just had so much grip, it was just darting around all over the place. Anytime you go from another racing game to F124, you're like, what is wrong with this game? They have calmed it down a little bit. Not a lot, it's still a pointy front end, but honestly that kind of makes it fun to drive. It means, you can move the car exactly where you want to do it. It means it's nice and responsive, again, accessible for an inexperienced player. So it's okay. I think it's now just calm enough on the front end that it just about drives somewhat reasonably without being a crazy, insane, infinite grip front end. Traction 2, they've actually slightly increased the traction, or at least made it a little bit easier to get corner exits. But honestly, this ends up being a little bit more realistic. Previously, the F1 games, although it's fun to have a challenging traction model, I mean, personally, I actually liked F122, which had ridiculously low traction, but it was a fun challenge. Actually, in real life, if you look at their throttle inputs, they really quite quickly get up to full throttle. They'll be in third gear, still turning the wheel, and they'll quite quickly get to full throttle. They won't floor it, but they'll quite quickly get there. Previously, even F124, you had to be a little bit more cautious than that because the car was just going to slide on you, and if you're sliding, you're going slowly. So yes, there's a little bit more traction, but overall, I think it's an improvement. I think it makes it feel a little more realistic, and you can use a little bit more throttle on corner exits, particularly the exits where you're slightly still turning. Now, bumps and curbs usage were some of the things that were massively dumbed down for F124 compared to 23. Now, it is still easy to take a lot of curb, but the car is slightly more affected by bumps and curbs. Not much. You do notice it a little bit, but fundamentally, it doesn't actually change how you drive. You still launch over the curbs, mostly because it is beneficial to do so. But again, comes back to it being an accessible game. If you spun every time you went near a curb, people would just get frustrated with it. It's unfortunate, but it is what it is. They've taken a small step in the right direction here. Where they have taken a slightly bigger step, though, is the bottoming out over curbs. Now, this happened on one or two curbs in F124, where if you straddled the curb, the car would bottom out and you would lose some time. They've definitely increased this effect. It is now easier to bottom out, and sometimes if you do take too much curb, the car bottoms out and slows down significantly, and you lose momentum. You do really want to avoid bottoming out over curbs. So that's something, definitely. On to braking then, and the overall braking effect is definitely reduced. The braking zones are a little bit longer. I'd say also it feels a little bit more forgiving on the braking, as in if you get it a little bit wrong and lock up a little bit, it doesn't just, immediately lock up and you go deep or you start sliding. It seems to sort of forgive you a little bit, and you can just sort of correct it mid-braking zone without it being a big disaster. Now, again, braking is quite forgiving, I'd say, similar to last year. But, it's not necessarily completely easy. You can still lock the rears going into corners and stuff, and the car, particularly if you're running a custom setup, which we'll get onto in a little while, definitely does move around a little bit on the brakes. It's not massively easy. I just say it's slightly more forgiving overall than last year, but ultimately the braking zones are a little bit longer. But unfortunately, because they're still making this accessible handling model, there is still way too much grip over the limit. Now, what we see in real life and in other sims is that when you get wheel spin or some oversteer, it's quite hard to control, because where before, if that tyre had perfect grip, you weren't sliding in some way, you had quite a lot of grip. When you go over the limit of that grip, the tyre grip quite quickly drops away from you. This is why F122 handling was bad though, because that drop was too sudden and too severe. So as soon as you got a bit of wheel spin, whoa, you got no rear grip. It's much harder to spin in F1 24 and 5 than it was to 23 and before. They have still got that slightly weird thing where if your car's sideways, there's almost like a force pushing against you. It's kind of weird. It means, sometimes if you get a little bit of wheel spin on the exit, you go a little bit sideways. It means you suddenly get a little bit of drag on the car. This is the same as it was on 24. You get a little bit of drag on the car, and it's not really very realistic. I guess it's one of the compromises they've had to make for an unrealistic hand model to make it so that, drifting genuinely isn't faster, which I think, we would all want. And then finally, on the feel of the handling, before we move on to some other things, I'm unsure about the F1 esports weird, over the limit, instant turn in, scrubbing the fronts type driving. Apparently that's been reduced and it's less likely to happen now, but as there's still so much grip over the limit of the tyre, I don't know. We'll have to wait and see once the esports guys get their hands on the game and we see an actual esports season, whether there'll be some cheese. I do feel like, though, overall, the physics are less likely to be cheesed. 25 overall, I think, it is where they actually want to be, rather than last year's game, which was just the physics were a little bit broken in certain places. So overall, a definite step forward for how the car feels, if you accept that it is an accessible racing game these days. But don't click off just yet, because there is some ways they've actually made it really quite realistic and just more fun to play, other than how the car feels on track. So the first of which is the off-track surfaces. So gravel and grass now massively reduce the grip that you get. Previously, you could go for a gravel trap and be pretty chill. Now, if you do it, you genuinely struggle to get back on the track. Now, the gravel trap doesn't slow you down as much as it does in real life. The drag on the car is still unrealistically low, but the grip is so low. It's genuinely difficult to drive your car through a gravel trap, which is absolutely awesome. I'd say the grip on the gravel, other than the drag not being enough, is now quite realistic. Now, the grass also follows this. The second you go on any grass, you get that massive pickup on your tyres, which looks much better this year. I'd say it stays on your tyres for a little bit longer than last year, but massively reduces the amount of grip you have when you do it. So where previously, if you touched a bit of grass, you were like, whatever, doesn't really matter that much. This year, if you've got a bit of grass on your tyres, particularly outside tyres going through a corner, you will really feel the effects. You will want to avoid getting grass on your tyres this year. And interestingly as well, it also drags on the car quite a lot more. If you accidentally get on the grass a little bit, particularly in a straight, you will really notice that the cars around you will just then start to have a run on you. I'm not saying it instantly drops you by 50 kilometers an hour. It's nothing that extreme. But, in a straight where you're trying to get every little brake horsepower you possibly can, that little bit of drag, if you accidentally touch a little bit of grass, just affects momentum a little bit and does make a difference. I most noticed this on the apex of the first corner in the second sector of Australia, where on last year's game, you would just take as much grass as you can to get the optimal racing line and not worry about it. Now, you don't want to do that. Not only is there not much grip when you're doing that, but because it drags on the car, you actually tend to get a bad exit. Now, maybe the F1 esports guys will be still using the grass here, but what I found was I was faster by making sure that I didn't get any grass on my tyres and I was just using the curb instead of the grass. So that is a much more realistic and good change. So onto the tyres then, and the tyres are actually quite different. The tyre wear is massively increased compared to last year. I don't have a number, but I would say it's 2 to 3 times more tyre wear than you got last year in general. Now, this may be unrealistic because we're seeing a lot of one-stop races again in 2025 season, but this is something that I was calling for to change because the hards were ridiculous on last year's game. They would just go for pretty much the entire race. It was insane and still had good grip. But now all the tyres just wear much, much more. It's looking like most races will be 2 stops, maybe even 3 stops, particularly if it's a 100% distance race. And you really have to look after the tyres. The softs in particular, after about 5 laps, you'll be praying for a pit stop. They are that bad. It is much, much higher, and it is going to make the racing much, much better. And there's other ways the racing is going to get better too. We'll get onto that in a moment. But in terms of how the tyre wear feels then, honestly, it makes the car a little bit sort of slidey. When I first had worn tyres in this game, I wasn't a big fan of it. I just sort of thought, oh, why is this car moving around? But the more I've played it, the more I've enjoyed it. It means you know that you've got worn tyres and you either want to pit to get off them, or you've really got to try and nurse them to not get to that point, or if you have got to that point, you just got to try and maximise it the best you can, even though you know your car is going to be sliding around. It does mean that the undercut is, in theory, a little bit more powerful now because the tyre wear rates are higher, but in reality, I didn't necessarily find this. But what I do find, though, is having just 1 lap fresher tyres, and, even more so if you've got 2 or 3 lap fresher tyres, is a big advantage again. Where on last year's game, because the tyre wear was so low, if you pit 2 laps after somebody, you wouldn't really notice in this stint. You have a very small advantage over them, but it'd be very small. But now if we're talking about having 5 or 10% of wear per lap on the tyres, particularly the softs, if you pit 1 lap after somebody, you've got 5% better tyre wear than them immediately. So genuinely, the overcut is really powerful. If you can avoid losing tuning positions in doing it, you'll have much fresher tyres, and this is a good change. Honestly, the tyres, the wear system is much better this year. It's going to be so much more fun. And in terms of the temperatures as well, they seem pretty much identical, honestly, to last year. I haven't really noticed any difference in terms of how much the tread heats up, how much the core heats up, the sort of optimal working windows. The temperature system just seems to be pretty much unchanged. I've got an AI video coming out very soon where we're looking very closely at the behavior of the AI. Unfortunately, the AI still don't simulate tyre temps. So on those tracks where your tyres might overheat, the AI will still have an advantage over you, but that is lessened by just increasing your tyre pressures. We'll get on setups in a second. But before we do, I want to talk about racing. Just the general racecraft, not really the right word, how the car feels in a pack, I suppose, is what I mean. Now, first up, the dirty air is massively increased. I'm talking about 4 times the effect. 4 times dirty air compared to last year and the year before, because dirty air has never been very strong in the F1 games. But I would say it's not necessarily, and no, not necessarily, I'd say it is not to the detriment of the racing, because it seems to only really affect you when you get really close to the car in front. So you can normally stay within DRS range, but it doesn't feel too awful to drive until you get really close. But actually, what that does is spreads out the pack a little bit. Rather than having constant DRS trains, and the DRS trains do still exist for a reason we'll get onto in just a second, if you're playing online, the trains should be able to break up a little bit easier. Where previously, if a car was half a second a lap slower than you, and I'm not exaggerating, they could stick with you just by having DRS and no dirty air. That will not be the case on F1 25. But unless you're racing the AI, now I could be wrong on this, but it does feel like the AI has less dirty air than the player. If they tested this and they found if the AI has the same dirty air as the player, they just never overtake each other, they never overtake the player, it's boring. Maybe I'm not against it. I know you guys are already in the comments saying, oh, that's rubbish. I get it. But actually, to be honest, the racing I've had against AI has been the best it's been probably ever in the F1 game, genuinely. I mean, they could do it getting a bit quicker. Again, I've got a dedicated AI video coming up. But the dirty air, because you've got that dirty air, it's genuinely hard to overtake them. It's hard to get close enough to be able to make those easy moves. The AI, though, yeah, definitely do seem to be able to follow each other more closely, which is a bit of a shame. But I'd say the slipstream is also reduced. It is now much harder to follow. The DRS trains, particularly online, where everyone's going to have the same dirty air, are going to be much reduced, which is, for me, very welcome. If someone's half a second lap quicker, they deserve to be pulling away. The guys behind shouldn't be sticking with them. One final thing on the racing is the engine temperatures. Now, these seem to change much more slowly, where on last year's game, the engine temperature changed really quickly, increased or decreased, probably unrealistically. It's a big, I don't know what engines are made of in F1, but a big chunk of metal that's not going to change temperature that quickly. Now, it does change temperature very slowly, so it means it increases very slowly and decreases very slowly. First of all, I like that. Second of all, the engine temps seem to be slightly affected by dirty air more than last year. You will find your engine will start to get a little bit hotter with some dirty air, but honestly, not that much. We've had it previously where the engine will be more affected by dirty air than it is in this year's game, but I'd say it's increased compared to last year, so another way that makes it slightly harder to follow your rivals. But honestly, your engine only gets very slightly hotter with dirty air. This is a pretty minor effect. On to car setups then, and first thing to know is that default setups seem to be better this year. Where previously default setups were always just understeery messes that were really slow, this year they're still understeery, but they're more drivable. Custom setups, I'd say, are still worth, in my experience so far, at least half a second. Realistically, I think that'll probably get up to more like a second a lap by the time setups start to advance a little bit more. And also in the custom setups, they have removed the engine braking setting. Now, this was only introduced last year. They obviously didn't like what people were doing with it. I guess it's locked to somewhere like 70% engine braking if you're interested compared to last year. maybe a little bit more, something like that. So there is some engine braking there, but you can't change it anymore. To be honest, I'm not really going to miss it. But overall, the custom setup concept is broadly similar to last year, but it is different. I am seeing some different custom setups come through that are quick. I think give it a couple of months and we will start to have some different setup concepts to last year. That's not to say that your F124 setups completely won't work on F125. They'll be better than default, but you will still be at a disadvantage to someone who's got proper customized 2025 setups. On to damage then, and the first thing I want to note is side pod damage, because on last year's game, the side pod damage was broken. Genuinely, if you got side pod damage, and I'm talking about side pod, not floor damage, they are different, your race is basically over. Your engine will just overheat so much that it's an absolute joke that you genuinely losing like 2 or 3 seconds a lap just in the straights. And that's just not fun to drive. It's too much. Maybe it's real. Maybe it means you should retire, but it's a game. We're all here for fun. Make the engine get a little bit hotter, sure, but it was too much. This year, they've done exactly what I just suggested there. The engine now gets a little bit warmer with some side pod damage. You get a little bit more drag, but it doesn't end your race. You are compromised. I don't know what it costs you. I'd say it half a second a lap, maybe. So you still want to avoid it, but it's not completely race ending now. You can drive around it. And maybe with some lifting and coasting, you could still keep your engine temperatures under control. I'm not too sure. So that is, I want to see more of a bug fix, but a welcome change for me. Now, interestingly, sim damage seems to have been reduced. Now, floor damage seems pretty much unchanged, as does the various other damage rates. But when you got simulation front wing damage, you seem to be able to have a bit more contact now without getting damage. I'm unsure how I feel about this, honestly, because sim damage was quite extreme last year, to be fair. It wouldn't take much contact at all to give you damage. I've actually had quite a bit of contact on sim damage, and had no damage come up. Maybe it's a good thing, maybe it's a bad thing. I don't know. I haven't really got an opinion on it. It is what it is. Sim damage on the front wing, at least, is definitely reduced. Where it's not reduced, though, is on the rear wing. Now, I reversed into a wall, damaged my rear wing, and just like last year, the car was pretty much undrivable. Maybe this is to be changed again. Maybe we shouldn't be making race-ending things. I think it probably is a little bit extreme, even if it's real. Again, it's still a game for fun. It's meant to be accessible. I don't know. I think some things should heavily compromise your race. I'm not too upset with this, although maybe it should be reduced. On to wet weather then. And honestly, it seems to be pretty much unchanged from last year. You know, the grip drop-off seems pretty much the same. It's sort of still drift mode a little bit by the fact you've got so much grip over the limit of the tyre still, just like in the dry. It's fine. It's not easy to drive in the wet. You do feel the lack of grip, and the car does move around a little bit more. It's sort of fine, but pretty much unchanged from last year. Also, unfortunately, unchanged from last year is that the full wet tyres are pretty much useless. I ran a very wet race at Austria, which was, you know, definitely full wet tyre conditions, and I was actually very slightly quicker on the inters. Honestly, it's basically never really worth going to full wets, which is fine. It's sort of realistic to what we see in real life. The problem is sometimes the AI in those conditions would go to full wets. So if you've got a situation where there's maybe 5 laps of full wet conditions, if you stay out on inters, you might lose a few tenths a lap to the AI, but then they'll have to pit twice because they'll go to full wets and then back to inters. So it's fine. I'd probably rather the full wets were more usable so the AI don't get compromised, or at least the AI just never really use them, because they are basically useless in all but the most extreme of conditions. And even then, yeah, barely worth using. Now on to a couple of quick points before we conclude. First of all, it'd be remiss of me not to mention the controller. The reason that it's such a small point and I'm not mentioning it till now is because I'm not a controller kind of guy. I don't use the controller, so I don't know what I'm doing with it. I found that on F124, the majority of people who said, no, I actually really like this handling model, were on controller. And it's more so the same this year. They've improved the handling. It's now going to feel even better on controller. One interesting point, though, is that they do seem to have reintroduced some sort of pad assist, as it used to be called, some sort of almost stability control. If you go from driving on a wheel to driving on a pad, you'll be able to see this. You can pretty much floor the throttle mid-corner, which you wouldn't be able to do on the wheel because you'd have a big slide, and you don't really get a slide on the pad. So I just hope it doesn't get to the point like it used to be where the pad in certain situations is genuinely faster. Now, I know there's dedicated pad drivers out there going, what the hell, it's never been faster. I get it. Monaco is always a wheel track, but there is some tracks that the pad, if you were good at it, genuinely used to be a little bit quicker than the wheel, which in my opinion for a driving game should never really be the case. Pad should never be better than a wheel, only ever as good as. Fundamentally, if you're on a controller, you will probably like the handling model of this game because the game's basically built for you. And one final thing, which is a bit of a footnote really, is the FPS. I've had a lot of people ask about this. Previously, 60 FPS, lower FPS was theoretically a little bit better than higher FPS than 120 or 144 or whatever frame rate. Honestly, unless you're an esports driver, this won't have affected you. If you're an absolute top league racer, and I mean like PSGL, WR, tier 2 level of like, knocking on the door esports level, maybe it affected you. I've done PBs on 60 FPS, then I've done a PB on 120 FPS, then I've beaten it again on 60. What it feels like to me, not being one of the 0.01%, is it has been reduced a little bit. I previously, when you went from 60 FPS to, in my test case, I went to 200 FPS, you would feel differences. The bumps would feel a little bit different, and particularly the force feedback in the wheel would feel different. The only real difference I felt when I changed FPS was in the smoothness of the frame rate. That was by far the biggest change. Going from 60 to 200 FPS, the game was smoother, so it made it slightly nice to drive. The bumps felt very similar. Their force feedback, honestly, felt the same, which I've never had before, so possibly that's something they've changed this year. There were certain differences that I could maybe point to, but honestly, I think it's more placebo by the fact the game was running smoother than anything else. I do feel like the FPS differences are reduced more than they ever have been, if you're interested in that kind of thing. But honestly, for the last couple of years, I think it's been a complete non-issue for 99.9% of us. But anyway, that was a lot of analysis. That was a lot of reviewing. Overall, how is the handling on F1 25? Well, as I said, I think you have to accept this isn't a sim. They're trying to make this an accessible game. Accept that. Accept it's not necessarily going to be a realistic game, and I think you'll enjoy it. That is what I've personally found. When I first played it, honestly, just like at the launch of F1 2024, I was a little bit down. I was a bit like, oh, here we go again. And look, on F1 24, I never hated the handling model. It wouldn't be the handling model I'd have chosen, but I never enjoyed it. I never enjoyed the driving experience of F1 24. F1 25, I'd say there's been some enjoyment there. I'd say it's in terms of how you feel about the game when you drive it, I'd say there's quite a big change there. Despite just small changes, there's quite a big change there. And you've got some of the bigger changes like the tyre wear and the dirty air and stuff that's going to make the racing better. Regardless of how the car feels, the racing's going to be better. And I think this is actually overall a pretty decent step forward, dare I say it, because it's still based on the divisive 24 handling model. I know. And I was one of the key people that was against the 24 handling model. I think it's a decent step forward this year, and I am not the only one to think that. The people I've been speaking to that have been playing it have all been saying, yeah, we're actually really enjoy driving this game. So I'm genuinely interested to hear what you guys think, just like it was on last year's game. Last year, it was divisive. That's the best way to put it. It was a divisive handling model. This year, I think will be much less divisive. Is everyone going to love it? No. If you like a sim, are you going to like it? Probably not. If you're the 95% of everybody else, I think you're going to enjoy it, and I think that'll include me. But anyway, guys, that's been my big old handling review of F1 25. Drop a sub if you haven't already. We've got lots more reviews coming this week. We've got an AI review. I've got graphic settings review. I'm going to review all the new tracks, all the new changes, the LiDAR scan tracks. There's loads of stuff coming out this week, guys. Drop a sub if you haven't already. I really would appreciate it, especially if you found this video useful, and I will catch you next time. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.